Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yep.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you for joining us. I know some folks are just getting into the room, so we'll get a little introduction to our topic and get going here. My name is Kristin Dziczek. I'm the Senior Vice President for Research at the Center for Automotive Research. And I wanted to give some background. You know, one of my very first jobs in the auto industry was working on the bill of material for experimental cars at Buick City in Flint. And I learned then, and I continue to be amazed about how this industry brings together 30,000 parts from throughout the United States, North America, and over 180 different countries to make millions of the most complex pieces of machinery that anyone will ever buy, and that those vehicles then last 15, 20 years. It's nothing short of a miracle what this industry pulls off every day. And our auto supply chains seem to be smooth, but in reality, even in the pre-COVID days, supply chain managers were miracle workers. They would source and resource around floods, fires, tornadoes, financial insolvencies, labor disputes, international conflict, and just plain logistics tie-ups to keep the production running no matter what. And with COVID, they stepped in to bring the might of the auto supply chain to making ventilators and PPE. There really should be an award that goes to all of the supply chain managers in this industry. It's been an incredible couple of months. COVID and that 2020 production shutdown and all the changes that flow from that have made these jobs even harder. Globally, we've lost 9 million units of production this year to the chip shortage and another 400,000 units to Fukushima, Texas storms, COVID shutdowns, and now the China power outage that is impacting magnesium and other inputs. In North America, 2.4 million lost units, and in the US, 1.4 million, and about 96% of that is due to the chip shortage. Production at nearly every US auto plant has been impacted, and by extension, the web of suppliers, whether or not they make the parts that have chips in them. It is impacting automakers and suppliers, their revenues and profits. And each time we have a major production disruption, we learn something. From the 2011 Japanese tsunami to those floods in Thailand, the PA had 12 resin shortages in the fire in Germany. All of these things lead us to reevaluate the supply chain, evaluate the risks, make up backup plans to the backup plans to the backup plans, and dig deeper into the supply base to get a better understanding of where that next disruption may come from. And visibility into your supply chain may not be enough. Today's presentation from PwC will discuss how to build resiliency into your supply chain that will help your company weather any storm or disruption ahead. And I'm very happy to have with me Paul Carrannanto, who's a principal at PwC, to kick off this webinar. So Paul, take it away.
Hey, good morning, Kristin. Thanks so much for the introduction, and really excited to be here today. This is a topic that's affecting everybody in the industry. So I hope it's relevant, hope it's timely, and hopefully it will help provide some useful information that companies can use to create that resilience that we were just talking about. So first of all, let's go to the next page. I'm Paul Carrannanto, and I'm a principal in our automotive and industrial strategy practice for PwC, and I've been in the auto industry for over 25 years. Similar to you, I did my original work in the auto industry was for an OEM. I was with an OEM for about 9 years, and worked in many parts of the company and saw it from the inside out. And for the last 20 years, I've been consulting for automotive and industrial companies throughout the value chain. So really excited to be here. I want to hand it off to my colleague Akshay to introduce himself.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Akshay Singh. I'm a partner at PwC in our automotive and industrial practice. Work with OEMs and tier 1 suppliers and tier 2 suppliers and strategy and operations projects. I mean, like Paul, I also spent around 10 years in the industry, worked at an OEM and at a tier 1 supplier for almost 10 years. So I, have seen it all. been working with PwC for the last 10 years now, so have been within automotive for my entire career. So really excited to be here to share some of the thoughts on what we are seeing in the industry and what some of the action suppliers are taking to actually navigate the current supply chain crisis. Tanjeff?
Yeah, thanks, Akshay. My name is Tanjeff Schadt. I'm a director in the Munich office of PwC Strategy End, which is the strategy consulting arm of PwC. I'm focusing on automotive, but more specifically on high-tech application into automotive, where all the chips are coming into the vehicles. So that also means my second focus is on the microelectronics industry, more specifically semiconductor clients around the globe. So I'm also part of the PwC Semiconductor cluster, which is a global community of more than 100 people taking care of semiconductor clients. As my colleagues, I have also spent more than 10 years in the industry before joining consulting, and primarily focus now on electronics and software with a special focus on automotive.
Great, thanks Tanjeff and Akshay, and we're really excited to be here. So let's jump into it. If we go to the first page, so every year PwC does a survey of the manufacturing and industrial sector, and we survey COOs of over 600 companies. And what we found from this year's survey is that no surprise, supply chain is the top priority for senior executives over the next 1 to 2 years. Among those priorities, right, beyond supply chain, things like cybersecurity and digitalization of sales and factories. But the number one priority that's impacting everyone right now, especially if you listen to all the investor calls and the earnings presentations, is supply chain. So that's why we're going to do a deep dive on that topic today. Next page. And as Kristin mentioned, these supply chain disruptions are happening with increasing frequency. Going back to the tsunamis in India and Japan back in in the early 2000s, and then the more recent disruptions that we're seeing because of the COVID pandemic and the chip shortage. These disruptions are not just freak events. They're happening with increasing occurrency and increasing severity, right? And it's impacting everyone in the supply chain, not just OEMs, not just suppliers, but even down to the chip manufacturers and the people that are pulling the minerals out of the ground. So it's really been a crisis that needs to be addressed, and it's something that the capabilities to mitigate and prevent future disruptions need to be top of mind for all executives. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. If you go to the next page, Trey. So what is the impact? And as Kristin mentioned, yeah, there's been some published reports and there's forecasts that, well, certainly we've lost about 16% of volume just due to COVID. So between 2019 and 2020, during the COVID era, we lost about 16% of global production volume, down from 89 to about 75 million units globally. And this year, the latest forecasts, and you can look at Automotive News and many other sources, they're projecting between 10 and 11 million units of production lost in 2021. And if you translate that to what does that mean for the OEMs, that's on the order of 260 to 300 billion of lost revenue for the OEMs, just due to not just the chip shortage, but other supply chain disruptions that were mentioned. It could be the labor shortage that we're seeing in the plants. It could be, like we said, the energy shortage and the rationing of energy in China. There's many different implications of the supply chain crisis, and as well the most recent one with the shipping and logistics industry and ports. So it's affecting the entire industry, and it's clearly a topic that needs to be addressed. So let's dive into some of the implications, and I'm going to hand it off to Tanjeff to talk a little bit about the chip crisis itself.
Right, thanks, Paul. So, if we look at the global microelectronics shortage, that was clearly driven, but also next to other root causes, by massive demand shifts. And it happened during COVID. And of course, there's long lead times and new orders and new capacities we're discussing. But really, to understand this, it's really necessary to also look a little bit deeper to actually understand the business logic behind the semicon industry. And if we look at this entire semiconductor market, what you see here on the left, so it's maybe a surprise that the electronics devices that are attributable to automotive, this is a sales share of only 8%. So that means for automotive OEMs and the suppliers that they suddenly find themselves in a very unfamiliar role with little purchasing power. And well, so that really one of the reasons for this chip shortage then, right? And in our work with semiconductor players, but also with their customers, so we really see the following 5 critical points. So first of all, in the context of the pandemic, the automotive industry has drastically reduced demand at a very short notice. So this was then forcing semiconductor fabs, they are planned, of course, to run at full capacity, to refill with other capacities, so with chips from other industries. So, and at the same time, there was an increasing demand for consumer electronics during the pandemic. So this segment, and also in a wider sense, IoT devices, so these are the fast growing segments actually in the semiconductor market. And of course, automotive capacities are growing as well, but only moderately. So this also brings us to the conclusion that these capacities will not just come back for automotive without doing nothing. Yeah. Then also another fact is that automotive chips, they run on mature nodes. So we're talking about 40 to 65 nanometers. And at the same time, these consumer and IoT devices, they largely run on the same production technology. And therefore there's competition for these capacities. Investment reluctance, that's also a good topic to talk about, because it's not so easy for semicon players to just increase capacities. So expanding capacities in existing fabs, so then we're talking about like expanding clean rooms, this already takes up to 2 years. So if we discuss new fabs, we're talking even up to 6 years. And for new fabs, the capex that has to be spent, it's easily beyond $1 billion. If we talk to large fabs that are running on newest technologies, we are even discussing here a multiple of that. So the semicon industry, they have been prepared for a long time for a boom and bust cycle, which they are facing for decades. So, and they will not just easily push large investments in the short term just because of the chip crisis. So furthermore, there are also geopolitical aspects. So there's purchasing bans, also having prompted Asian players to stock up. And one prominent example here is Huawei. So, and most people don't know that last year, only in a few months, they actually ordered a stock of 2 years. So really also sucking the market empty. And last but not least, also like, and Paul already mentioned this, there were a lot of supply chain disruptions like the snow blizzards, like stuck cargo ships or fires in the clean room, but this has always been there, and this will, of course, always happen in the future. And always the question is how you will mitigate your risks in here. With this overview, let me pass on to Akshay, and he will now have a closer look to critical material shortages that go beyond semiconductors.
Thanks, Tanjeff. So as Paul mentioned that, these supply chain disruptions are frequent, and we're going to see, after this crisis passes, we're going to see another crisis. It's not a matter of when, it's a matter of if, right? So it's really important to understand really going forward that what are some of the critical automotive materials that may be at risk of future disruptions, right? And these disruptions could be because of limited supply, because of expected demand growth within automotive, and also demand growth beyond automotive. So as we are actually working with our clients, both OEMs and suppliers, we are advising them that it's really important to understand what are some of those critical materials. Some of the critical materials we have identified here is like, especially around battery materials, it's cobalt, lithium, and graphite, but there are other materials also, aluminum, rubber, and silicon, right? So, but it's not limited to just 6 we have mentioned on the page, there are others as well, right? So it's really important for OEMs and for the suppliers to understand what are those critical materials within their systems and subsystems, and what can be done, what kind of visibility they need to actually get in order to ensure that they actually manage future disruptions better than how the current disruption was managed, right? So and so with that, like, I hand it over to Paul, who's going to talk about what are some of the capabilities we are seeing within the supply base when it comes to supply chain visibility, and what are the steps some suppliers can take, and on some of the and what help we are actually as PwC providing to some of our clients in developing those capabilities.
Great, thanks, Akshay. If we go to the next page, we're going to give you just a perspective on what we see as industry-leading practices, and these are capabilities that we see OEMs and suppliers and other industry players developing to create what we call visibility, agility, and resilience in their supply chains. So I'll walk through this. We call it the supply chain risk management maturity model, but basically, many of the companies that we work with today are at either level 1 or 2. They have
the booster for the Pfizer as well as
I think there's somebody might need to go on mute, but many of the companies that we work with are at level 1 or 2 with basic visibility into the supply chain. So as you can imagine, when the disruptions happened back in 2008, with the financial crisis, and then back in 2011 with the Fukushima earthquake, there was a lot of what we call risk management portals set up, right, with the first tier suppliers. You wanted to know what was happening with your first tier suppliers and monitor their financial and operational risks. And those have been in place for a while, but clearly they haven't gone deep enough to pick up and sense and detect risks at the deeper levels, like the semiconductors and the chip manufacturers. So what we see is some companies starting to go to level 2 with more enterprise visibility, looking at not just their first tier suppliers, but the entire supply chain, beyond tier 1 suppliers. But still, it's somewhat of an ad hoc, right? It's not fully automated. It's largely in spreadsheets, daily escalation meetings, providing visibility to their customers and trying to get visibility from their suppliers. So we see a lot of companies in level 2 trying to create that enterprise visibility in order to react and prioritize their actions, but it's certainly not what we would call agility.
Yeah, I think just one point I want to make here is that we recently worked with an OEM on supply chain resilience project, and in our discussion with the OEMs, and OEM said most of their supply base is actually at level 1 and level 2. They have not seen anyone at level 3. So the client we are working with right now is actually helping them develop that level 3 capability, but it's hardly anyone in the supply base right now who has level 3 maturity level. So
I think that's right, Akshay. At least the ones we work with and the practices that we're aware of from the OEMs, very few, if any, are at level 3. And that's kind of an aspiration. We know the OEMs are certainly going there, and we're working with several OEMs to help create that smart control tower. And what does that mean? What is agility? I think of agility as the ability to react, to sense and respond in real time, right? You have visibility in place. Now you got to start making decisions in real time. And so it's all about real time sensing and risk and scenario planning. It's somewhat automating the decisions on how to plan and optimize inventory and production scheduling, given the changing dynamics of supply availability. It's integrating your forecasting processes beyond your tier 1 suppliers into the tier 2s, 3s, and 4s that are critical to your supply chain. And then it's optimizing and having mitigation actions in place for all the different logistics routes, right? Oftentimes companies don't have second or third routing options available for them if their carriers are at risk of disruptions due to labor shortages. So that needs to be integrated into the plan, not just your direct material suppliers. And then really the level 4 is somewhat of an aspiration. We don't think anyone is truly at level 4, but that we think this is required to get to the idea of resilience. When we think about resilience, it's all about predicting and anticipating disruptions before they happen, and having the right mitigation actions and alternatives in place before the situation happens, as opposed to reacting to the situation after it happens. So that's all about predictive analytics. It's proactive risk management of all your critical supply chains, and it's deeply looking into the supply chains and prioritizing which ones are at risk, such as chips, such as logistics, such as the critical materials that Akshay mentioned. It's really developing a deeper risk management plan for all those supply chains, and then in some cases it's creating new sources of supply. One of the things we're seeing in the industry now is direct sourcing of critical materials such as the battery materials for lithium-ion battery cells. And the OEMs want to go direct to the chip suppliers in some cases and source the chips and direct the buys to their suppliers. So that's a new trend that we're seeing with several OEMs. So it's really changing the dynamics of the supply base and finding new risk mitigation actions to prevent these actions from happening, and then clearly integrating all the processes that need to be orchestrated to make it happen, from your SIOP planning and scheduling processes and all the other logistics, routing, and real-time things that need to happen to protect your supply chain. So this is it's an encompassing model, but like we said, we think most companies are somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2 based on the current capabilities that we see in the industry. Let's go to the next page. So this page just shows an illustrative view of what some of the capabilities that are required to move up the chain on the stages of maturity. So it's around a number of different dimensions, right? Enterprise performance and risk management, that's always been a focus, but demand management, inbound supply management, capacity planning and resourcing, and then ultimately it's the trust and transparency, right? There are many risks beyond just supply chain risks that need to be managed and mitigated, because of all the ESG concerns in the industry today. So it's really across these 5 dimensions that we see companies putting in new capabilities and new processes to manage and mitigate all those risks. And then as you go up the stages, from level 1 basic visibility, it's more about the immediate supply base. Level 2, it's bringing in improved forecasting and visibility tools for the deeper supply base on the direct material side and on the logistics side, and starting to integrate your planning and forecasting processes across the supply chain. Level 3, you see some new capabilities for end-to-end views of your suppliers and your tiers, tier 2, 3, 4 logistics and material movements. Automating some of the actions, in order to sense and respond, you have to be able to automate some of the decisions and some of the processes. And then it's being able to trace the materials all the way back to the sources of supply and identify what risks are happening. And then finally, on the resilience front, again, this is aspirational for most companies. It's really having that predictive view and putting in the predictive analytics to understand what's happening in other markets that could impact my supply chain, such as in the consumer markets or in adjacent markets that are in high demand of the same materials. And then putting in the proactive measures to protect those supply chains, mitigate the risks, and then dynamically adjust your plans to match the current environment. So it's really a maturity of going from reactive to real time and then predictive. And we see a lot of investments and a lot of new processes being put in place to move companies up this curve. Go to the next page, Ray. So what we wanted to do now is really open it up to the audience and get the audience to opine on where you feel your company is at in this model, and where you feel you're at, whether in level 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we'll have a polling question here for about a minute, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A after that. So go ahead and enter your responses. Kristin, I'm not able to see the polling window. Are you getting some responses in?
I'm just seeing the poll too. We'll switch to the responses in a moment once.
Okay. We'll sit tight.
Yep. And there they are.
Perfect. Well, it's an interesting feedback, and I'm sure we'll get more responses coming in as we go through it. But, as we said, most of the respondents are indicating that they're either at level 1 or level 2 on the visibility side of things. Looks like some companies are starting to invest in the agility capabilities. but really nobody is at that resilient stage. And I think that's reflective of where the industry is at, given all the reactions that are happening in the industry today. So I think that's a good place to start with maybe some reactions, maybe Akshay and Tanjeff, maybe if you guys could weigh in on how you see this poll relative to your clients, and then Kristin, if you want to, open it up after that to the broader questions.
No, I said, I think, as I mentioned, Paul, based on my discussions with the OEMs I'm working with and the clients I'm working with, there are very few who are at level 3, if any, right? So there are, as Paul indicated, there are some at level 1 and level 2, but there were hardly any at level 3. So it's good to see that at least some of the supply base is actually moving towards level 3, but ultimate end goal is to actually get level 4, right? As Paul, you mentioned that, these supply chain disruptions are frequent, and we're going to see another one. The question is whether supply base is going to be ready next time when it happens next time around, right? And given the impact it has on the profitability and the revenue of the supply base and the OEMs, I think it's imperative that the supply base invest in the capabilities to ensure that it is managed better when it happens next time around.
Yeah, actually, maybe in addition, so we also had a look on the electronics part of the supply chain. So I also see that there is some companies actually that can reach, let's see, something between level 2 and 3, so depending on what kind of part of supply chain we're talking about. But even having really innovative cloud solutions in space, like direct connection of data real time already with their suppliers. Even then, so nobody really managed to get better to the chip crisis. Yeah. So there's best practices existing, but of course there's a lot of room for improvement. So that's also my perception here.
Very good. Well, appreciate the audience's responses on that. Kristin, I'm going to hand it off to you for the Q&A session.
Well, great. Thank you very much. That was very informative. When I looked at your slides earlier, I was very curious as to see how many of our respondents would be in level 3 or 4, which seems, like a platonic ideal of, full transparency. And on the topic of transparency, I'd like to start off with, industry, some customers and even governments are demanding transparency into especially the supply chain around semiconductors. And I just want to know, what does that, you talked about trust and transparency in your slides. What does transparency look like? And how do suppliers respond to that? I mean, some of this is very closely guarded business information that your clients, your customers, and governments are looking to harvest to get a broader look at how these supply chain disruptions are impacting our economy. So talk a little bit more about trust and transparency and what transparency really means.
Sure, I'll take a cut, Kristin, and then I'll hand it off to my colleagues to weigh in as well. I mean, transparency and visibility are probably the #1 topics we see in the industry right now. And I think the answer to your question probably is different depending on who you're talking about, right? There's a different level of trust and transparency between OEMs and suppliers, right? Because they have the direct, contractual relationships, and they have to provide transparency to operate the business, right? So OEMs are going to expect and demand more transparency and trust in the supply chain, to do business going forward, right? We see that trend happening and increasing in terms of how deep they're going to require transparency into the supply chain, and how often and how urgent the reporting is going to be happening between OEMs and suppliers. Now, it's a little bit different answer, I think, for when the government wants to get involved and understand what the situation is and see what the implications are. I think certainly the government can play a role, right, in shaping policies and in helping provide incentives for investments in supply chain, whether it's infrastructure, logistics, it could be critical materials, that Akshay mentioned. And certainly there may need to be some additional reporting, right, between the companies and the government in order to do that. But I don't think any company that I work with would want to have the government micromanage their supply chains the same way they do with their suppliers. So I think there's probably a balance there. Maybe Akshay, you can weigh in on your.
No, I think you're correct, right? I think one thing I would add is that supply chain transparency. We saw that, during the COVID crisis, when the COVID hit, right, that a lot of the OEMs, they have visibility into, say, a tier one supply base, how the tier one supply is doing when it comes to financial health and some other things, but they had no understanding of, or really a good idea of, like, what the tier two supply base looks like, right? So, and what we mean by supply chain transparency is the end-to-end transparency, right? So it really starts with, okay, where the materials are coming from, where the materials are going, which subsystems the materials are going, and then looking at the supply base, what your tier 3 and tier 4 supply base looks like, for OEMs, and for tier ones, it's like, okay, what my tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4 supply base look like, whether I have visibility into that or not, because a disruption into a tier 4 supply base can really impact it's going to impact your supply chain, right? So it's end-to-end visibility. That's what we are talking about here. So.
Maybe Tanya, if you might want to comment on the implications for the chip suppliers in terms of this visibility.
Sure. So, I mean, supply chain transparency is actually, that's the first step. So you have, as Akshay put it already, starting from the materials really into the vehicle, and to understand that full supply chain. So that also implies to understand where are the front ends, the back ends located of the semicon supplier, and how many front ends does it have, how many back ends, and so on. Yeah. So this is super critical to really identify the risk that is inherent in the supply chain. And when it comes to the mitigation, so our clear recommendation is that for your critical parts, it's really actually coming down to a more closer relationship in the future, yeah, even to closer partnerships that we will see between automotive players and electronics and microelectronics, meaning semiconductor players. So that's definitely something that's needed, a more intimate relationship to jointly work on the mitigation measures.
I think, that's a really good segue into a question that I've also heard a lot of. When Ford went to the all aluminum F-150, they first sought to tie up enough aluminum supply to sustain that production. And aluminum suppliers weren't going to make that investment unless they had a customer that was going to buy a lot of aluminum. So we see automakers entering into joint ventures for battery cell production. Do you think semiconductors are going to reach that level of strategic importance where there are partnerships or joint ventures or co-investments? And are there other commodities that could rise to that level of strategic importance?
I'll start, and then I'll probably, Tanya, if you can chime in. But we are already seeing that, right? OEMs have already said that they are going to play an increasing role in managing semiconductors supply chain, either through directed buy, or to in certain instances actually working together with the chip manufacturers to, design the chips, right? So I think OEMs are already going to do that, and they have announced the plans, right? At least, have at least indicated that they're going to do that. And you can see more of that, because, demand for chips is only going to increase because of the increase in penetration of electric and autonomous vehicles, right? So the content is only increasing. So it is a very critical commodity, right? And it's going to continue to be a critical commodity going forward. Beyond that, absolutely, there are other materials that are critical, and some of those I talked about, especially the material that goes into batteries. And we see that OEMs are making partnerships. Even like if we give you an example, in the lithium-ion batteries, OEMs are now actually forming partnerships with mining companies to ensure that they secure the supply of, say, lithium or cobalt or or nickel, right? So and OEMs, we know that the clients I work with, they are actually evaluating which are some of the other critical materials and what should be the strategy to actually manage those critical materials going forward. Either it's partnerships, or it's JVs, or it's or something else, right? So yes, there are a lot of materials beyond semiconductors that are critical, and that list is only going to increase. So
We have a great question from the audience saying, looking at these, 20, 30,000 parts per vehicle, do you think you should have the same diligence to all of your parts? Or is there some way to prioritize the risk assessment? What dimensions would the risk assessment entail?
Yeah, I think that's what we talked about, right? And it's really important to really understand your systems and subsystems and what are some of the critical material usage within your systems and subsystems, right? Which subsystems or subsystems are more critical than the others, right? And where the supply is and demand is for some of those critical materials, right? So you actually have to prioritize. Obviously, you cannot really do everything. It's going to take a long time. So you start with like prioritizing that these are systems and subsystems that are really, really critical. And then these are some of the critical materials within those systems and subsystems that are important and that are critical. And it starts with that. And then you actually build visibility for those critical materials. And then you actually, as you actually move on, you just enhance those capabilities for other, other maybe semi-critical materials, right?
Well, I know you're talking a lot about the, your supply chain, what's below your company. One of the big things that's happening now, just about as I mentioned, just about every plant has been interrupted, some for months on end. Suppliers that may not be directly impacted by a shortage or a bottleneck might not even be aware that something is askew in the supply chain until their production is interrupted. So I think, you make seat foam, right? And the semiconductor crisis is impacting your business and your profitability. How do suppliers, you mentioned in the presentation, looking at other verticals, looking in consumer electronics and other people who are demanding those same commodities and inputs. But what about your supply chain has nothing to do with where these disruptions are taking place? How do you get that visibility outside of your supply chain, and how does you incorporate that into your business planning?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Kristin. I think it's going to require companies to look at new sources of data outside of their industry, right? There's many syndicated forecasts and market research and intelligence sources that can be purchased, and certainly there's other industry, consortiums that companies can tap into to get some of that market research. But it's really about understanding what's happening in the adjacent markets that could impact your supply chain, right? And you mentioned the chemicals one, right? And the shutdowns that happened as a result of some of the energy plants that were shut down earlier this year. But you're right. I mean, it could be happening in a completely adjacent industry that might impact the production for the OEMs, which then of course shuts you down, right? So I think unfortunately companies are going to have to look beyond their core industry and get intelligence and data sources and data feeds from many different industries, and then do that risk assessment. How critical, or what is the potential risk of these scenarios that we're seeing in the other industries? How could that affect us? In the perfect case in point was, the consumer electronics industry, right? The supply chain, the chip supply crisis wasn't really a supply crisis, it was a demand crisis, right? Because of the rapid changes in demand, dropping in automotive and massive uptick in electronics and consumer products. That was a demand shift that impacted, the source or the supply of chips.
I think, so just to add to what Paul said, I think the number one source of information for the supply base is the OEM, right? So they are actually developing that capability. The OEMs have now visibility, or actually at least developing the capabilities to have that visibility, right? So the number one source of the information from, for the supply base is from the OEMs. So if OEMs are demanding, supply chain transparency from their tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 supply base, now actually supply base can also demand same level of transparency for the OEMs for better business planning, right? As you mentioned, like for some of the suppliers, like seatbelt, like that has nothing to do with semiconductor prices, but their volumes are being affected, their business plan are being impacted, right? So they actually should expect the same level of transparency, and that's the level of trust that needs to develop between the OEMs and the supply base. And so that's why supply chain transparency not only goes one way, like it's both ways. So as if OEMs are demanding that supply chain transparency, then tier 1 and tier 2 supplier can also demand same transparency from the OEMs.
Yeah, and also let me add, when it comes to both OEMs and the suppliers, it's actually, especially if we're looking into the electronics and semiconductor space, there's a lot of capabilities that are still lacking at those players. So that certainly need to be built up in the future. So there's first seeds that we are seeing, but still there's a lot of room for improvement. Because then only you are able to pre-sense, at least as far as you can get, like upticking demands in other industry segments that actually compete on the same technology nodes, meaning the same production capacity space at those semiconductor suppliers. So that doesn't mean you have to actually replicate their capacity planning in the industry, which is impossible. But at least you have a good understanding of where it's really critical to secure your volumes and get the right allocations on a yearly basis.
I think we've got two questions that kind of go together here from the audience, and I think I'm going to pair them up and ask them both kind of as they are. One is, most tiers lack staffing and technology to support this ideal state for supply chain analytics, particularly in raw commodities. And the next is, what is the readiness needed internally, like ERPs, Industry 4.0, and the other elements of the digital transformation to be able to make it from level 1 to level 4 in your supply chain management paradigm?
Go ahead,
Paul.
Akshay.
Okay, no, so I'll start and then I'll hand it over to Paul. So, I mean, that's a great question. And we are actually seeing that across the supply base, right? This is a common problem, especially today, right? Where we have also labor shortages and staffing shortages. And that's why we feel that it's really important to enhance your digital capabilities and automate a lot of the systems, right? So that you don't have to rely on staff and resources to actually manage it. And that's where we have been focusing. Actually, some of the projects we are working on are actually helping clients develop those digital capabilities to automate some of these things where you don't have to deploy many resources, right? But you still need to do the homework and actually put that investment up front to ensure that you actually have those capabilities deployed, right? So, but that's a great question, and we feel that this is where the industry is going, that you need to have things automated. Otherwise, I mean, if you don't have some of the things automated, it will also take time to actually react, right? And I think it's really important for the supply base to invest in some of those capabilities, especially digital capabilities. Paul?
Yeah, and I'll try and add to that, Kristin. I mean, you mentioned about the ERP systems and what other capabilities would be required, and we have some backup materials on that. We didn't bring it today, but we do have a whole kind of detailed kind of illustration of all the capabilities that need to be brought together on the enterprise resources and on the other data feeds and other process capabilities for supply chain. So we can go through that another time, but I would say in general, you can't wait for the ERP systems to completely be fully integrated, right? I mean, you're not going to have time to do a full, transformation of your ERP systems in order to get the visibility that you need today. I think a lot of the companies, and we're helping several companies in putting analytics and predictive systems on top of ERP systems that are in existence today, right? And providing the real-time visibility and decision and scenario planning support that they need to do the daily escalation calls with their customers and with their suppliers. So putting in that basic level of visibility on top of your existing systems, I think, is probably the first step. But certainly longer term, you would want to harmonize and integrate your forecasting and planning systems in your ERP to give you that visibility in a more integrated fashion, right? So I think that's a longer term migration that needs to happen, but there's things you can do in the near term without doing a full technology transformation to get some of that, the visibility that we were talking about.
Well, that's great. One of the questions that comes up, I think, is it happened a lot during the beginning part of this crisis in chips, is this the end of lean? Are we going to be holding bigger inventories, bigger buffers? And one of the questions we have from the audience is, would you suggest increasing inventories? Are we going to go to fatter stores in order to have resilience in this world of constant disruption?
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Tanjeff and Paul, please chime in. So I think we did see that happening at certain suppliers after Japan tsunami, where for certain critical materials, some of the suppliers did increase their inventory level for some of the critical materials. And that's why there were some suppliers or some clients of ours who were actually manage the current crisis better in the end, like at least for the first few months, but because of how long it continued, like eventually they were impacted. But there were some who were able to manage it better because they had increased their inventory levels for some of the critical materials. So yes, I mean, you would see that some of the critical materials where there is a chance of disruption, where the lead times are long, there is no near supply base, you would see for some of those critical materials increase in inventory levels. And that's just one of the levers, right? There are other levers also to actually manage it better, but we do see that happening, and we are actually advising some of our clients to actually do that exactly going forward.
So to build on that, and thanks, Akshay. Kristin, on your question, is it the end of lean? No, I don't think it's the end of lean, but I think the rules and principles of lean need to be adjusted and tailored to the criticality and risks of the supply chain, right? Lean works great when you have predictable supply chain and predictable forecasting, right? If you have somewhat of a stable forecast from your OEMs, and you can plan and deliver and set up your supply chain to deliver just in time, it works great, right? Minimal inventory levels, you run your plants on a lean pull flow system. It works great when there's stability and predictability in your supply chain. It doesn't work great in a disruptive supply chain situation, right? And so that's why I think the rules of lean need to change, looking at it from the supply chain risk management perspective, looking at the financial and operational risks and the other adjacent market risks that you're exposed to. And you need to change your planning algorithms, right? Whether it's creating strategic buffers, right, for critical components. It could be having alternatives in place for dual sourcing or other substitute products in place, right? And I know a lot of OEMs and suppliers are looking at alternative substitution methods for replacing the chip. So there's a number of different ways to create that alternative risk management space, but certainly lean principles need to be adopted to the new normal.
Well, that's a really good tie-in to another question. One of the immediate tactical responses to this chip crisis has been to prioritize the high value, high demand vehicles and, put the, replacing parts or components as best you can into the things that you're actually have demand and have can sell and make money on. But that some of that you're going to have to, speed your validation and new supplier onboarding in order to make those kinds of shifts. How do you recommend suppliers look at having those alternative sources, have them ready and in the bag, already validated, or how do you get back up in production when you're making one of those shifts and bringing a new supplier on board?
So I'll start, and maybe Tanya, if you can kind of go into depth on the chip side. So I mean, there are some good examples out there, of companies doing things to accelerate what I would call supplier requalification and substitution. And there's even some published articles. I know that there was an article about what Tesla's doing on their chip and software designs, right, to make them more interoperable and redesigning the software to allow new chips to be requalified fairly quickly, right? Using new operating systems and new software algorithms to enable that requalification. So I think the concepts of interoperability and standardization of both hardware and software will enable what you're talking about, to enable requalification and substitution more quickly. Maybe Tanjeff, can you give us a deeper view on what that means at the electronics level?
Yeah, sure. So and actually what you just described is already a very good description of what you should do in the long term, for sure. Yeah. So a lot of value can be created here also, and cost can be taken out in smart validation concepts. Let me put it like this. And what does it actually mean for the chips? So we talked about closer relationships to semiconductor players earlier. And so currently you see it's just like a sales purchasing relationship. But actually, if you would have the capabilities to discuss with a test engineer in a semiconductor company of how to make this more smart and, let's say, get down from the 6 months maybe that you have for validating a chip, even if it's like an alternative you're forced to use because you are originally designed in chip is short now. That's actually a big challenge, and also at the same time, it's a big lever that you can have, right? To really reduce the lead time of this validation periods quite a lot. I mean, automotive chips per se, this is, it's all about reliability. So it's the most extreme requirements you have for chips across all the segments. And you can be much smarter on this one.
Well, that's great. And I think, as we move to these new electric vehicle platforms where, there's really a strategy for greater part commonality and interchangeability across, 18 to 20 different vehicles they can put on a skateboard. You're going to have these much higher volumes tied up in that common part too. So this is really going to be a critical period. One of the questions we have comes with one that I had too, is communication is really key amongst your supply chain, and there's some resistance to open and transparent communication, especially when you get lower in the supply chain to the tier 2, tier 3s. Do you have suggestions on how to improve communication through your own supply chain?
I'll start, or actually go ahead if you have a comment.
No, I think, as I mentioned, we saw this a common problem where, when the COVID crisis hit, that, when we evaluated the supply base, OEM had good transparency into tier 1 suppliers, but tier 1 did not really have that same level of transparency within their tier 2 and tier 3 supply base. So I think it starts with, tier 1s and then tier 2s that, work closely with their tier 2 and tier 3 supply base to, develop that transparency. That includes the communication, right? And, really define what transparency means, right? So transparency is, defined like certain elements like, okay, what is the financial health of your supplier, tier 2 or tier 3 supplier? Where are they getting some of the materials from? Where is their supply base located, right? And that level of trust, I mean, it's, as I mentioned, like, okay, it goes both ways, right? So, if tier 1s are demanding some level of transparency from tier 2 or tier 3 supply base, then they would also demand. And if they see probably the same level of communication from tier 1s, then probably they would also respond in kind, right? But I think you just need to really decide on, okay, what do you mean by transparent, Kristin? As you asked this question earlier, somebody in the audience asked, like, what do you mean by transparency, and define it, and then collect the information, and then provide the same level of information probably to your tier 2 or tier 3 supply base, so that you can actually open that communication channel, right? So.
Yeah, and to add to that, Kristin, I think there's probably changes that need to happen both in the speed and the type of information that needs to be shared between suppliers and the tiers. I mean, for years now, there's been, common practice of like standard monthly reporting on financial and operational metrics, right? That's what I would call the level 1 transparency from your suppliers that's expected nowadays, right? You got to give me your financial health and your delivery and quality and all your other production metrics as part of your standard monthly reporting. But that's not fast enough to mitigate a supply chain crisis, right? So during the crisis, we saw, daily escalations of both customers and suppliers, getting calls, on what are you going to do to keep my plant running, right? And how are you going to reprioritize and reallocate inventory to make sure that I get things to meet my production schedule? So those daily escalation calls that was a huge change in the speed and the accuracy of information that needed to be provided. And companies were stuck right in this crisis mode of having to have daily escalation meetings at 6 a.m. to get the data and have CEOs involved in these calls. That's not a sustainable model, right? So it's going to rely on accurate and insightful data coming from those systems that I talked about, right? The analytics and the systems to give you the transparency of how your supply situation is looking and what does that mean for your production and supply forecast to your customers. You need to have access to good data and good insights to be able to give daily updates, in some cases to your customers. So I think it's a must-have going forward in the future for tier ones to have that capability, and I think it's going to have to be extended to the lower tiers as well for the new normal.
I think, one of the questions I have is about, this administration. One of the first things they did when they came into office was charge groups to come up with 100-day supply chain reports, and then deeper involvement in looking at the strategic importance and the national security vulnerabilities in our supply chains. And I think, government leaders, politicians are seeing all of this disruption as, well, this is why we need to reshore everything and have it in the United States, everything. And, having things reshored, it has risks too. We had, when the COVID pandemic began, there was the moving hotspot around the country. It still is moving, I guess. The different areas are affected at different times, but that could, very much take down the auto industry when that was sitting over Detroit. And, there are localized weather issues that can impact here in the United States as well. The power outage in Texas, reshoring has inherent risks as well. Do you see a reshoring as a risk mitigation, or the other side of that is many eggs, many baskets, more atomization of the supply chain in order to have be able to shift quickly amongst suppliers and amongst regions that may be impacted by weather, pandemic, war, other kinds of things that can take down a region?
I think, Kristin, we're going to see both,
Mhm.
right? I think we are never going to live in a risk-free world, right? There will always be risks. The question is like how to best manage those risks going forward. So you would see for some material, yes, it's going to be a nearshoring. For some, probably not. So I think for each supplier and OEM, it's for them to evaluate like what makes sense and how to best manage those risks, right? But we're gonna see different strategies. Maybe for certain components, dual supply. For certain components or certain materials, going to be nearshoring. So we're gonna see different strategies deployed by OEMs and suppliers to manage the risk going forward, right? So, but there will always be risk. I don't think we can live in a risk-free world, right? So,
Agree, Akshay. And to add to that, Kristin, you're asking a pretty strategic question. Reshoring, and that's a question that all companies evaluate constantly in their annual and strategic planning, right? And that involves obviously tax and trade and other labor and logistics footprint decisions to look at reshoring and nearshoring. But all you have to do is look at some of the recent announcements, right? From several of the OEMs, right, with EV manufacturing and battery plant and battery cell facilities very close to the manufacturing facilities for the vehicles. I think there is a trend of what I would say localization of supply base for some of those critical materials that need to be close, especially when they're not easily transportable and shipped, like battery trays. Those are big items that you don't want to ship over long distances. So I think there is certainly a shift in seeing more localized manufacturing for those things, but it's a strategic call, and it certainly involves tax and trade agreements and the impact of all those other strategic decisions.
Right. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I want to throw one last question and thank all three of you, Paul, Akshay, Tanjeff. This has been very informative. The last question is actually the first one that came in, is when is the chip supply going to clear? When is this current crisis going to be over?
Yeah, actually, I can take this one without having my crystal ball with me. But so from what we see currently, it's most likely to go well into 2023 and beyond. So especially if you see like allocations that have been committed by semiconductor players for 2022. So that's also very limited across the whole year, and it will go well beyond 23. Also, having said this, of course, there might be exceptions to this. As always, there might be specific parts where it will ease up a little bit sooner, but overall 23 and beyond. So it will be there for a while. That's our prediction.
Great. Paul, do you have any last words?
No, I think it's been a good discussion, Kristin. Really appreciate your inputs and the inputs from the audience. And yeah, certainly this is a top of mind issue for all the industries. So yeah, happy to provide some perspectives and would love to have deeper conversations.
Yeah. Just to add to what Paul said, thanks everyone. And if anyone is looking for any additional information, obviously we couldn't share everything. If they're looking for any additional information on some of the stuff we shared, we are happy to share it with you. Just email, me, Paul, or Tanjeff, and we'll get back to you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, PwC, for this important webinar. And there's the contact information for these three gentlemen. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.